and welcome to the Attractive Christians podcast, where we make Christianity a little less repulsive and a little more attractive and beautiful. I'm Annie, one of the producers. In this episode, Ethan answers a couple of questions from a longtime friend of the show about open theism and what it feels like to have a connection with God. As always, make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you like to listen, follow us on all the socials, share it with your friends, and if you have any thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you. So send us a DM, or you can always Gmail us at attractivechristians@gmail.com.
I don't miss you anymore.
Oh my gosh, you guys, this is going to be the best episode you hear all day from Attractive Christians. I don't know if you listen to any other podcasts, but this is definitely the best episode you'll hear from Attractive Christians probably all week, to be honest, unless you're doing a whole listen through with a whole lot of our old episodes. So it's going to be so good. Welcome to Attractive Christians. I'm Ethan Renault, and shout out, as always, to our beloved and very attractive editors, Mark and Annie, or editor/producer, Mark and Annie. They're the best, and they're the reasons that you're listening to this show right now. It wouldn't exist without them. Let's see, what's new for Doors Open? I don't know. Okay, I guess here's a kind of a wild story. If you've ever seen videos or pictures of my crib, like where I record this, it's not huge. It's not the smallest home you'll ever be in, but it's not the biggest by far. And the other day, I was trying to get a game night together, and so I invited... I usually text about 10 people, and then half of them can't make it, text a couple more, and then I end up with like 7 or 8 people for a game night, and it's perfect. Perfect number of people for my crib, right? So this, not this week, but last Sunday, I was like, I sent out the text, and I was like, hey guys, game night at my crib, and I texted probably 13, 14 people, expecting half of them to say no, or they're busy or whatever. And then, the responses came back, and not only did every single person say yes, but like 5 of them said that they're bringing a friend or bringing a new girlfriend or bringing a coworker. And so my place ended up being packed with people. And in my tiny little crib, we had 18 people crammed in here, like so many people that you couldn't move. We all just kind of had a spot, and we had to think, what games can we play with this many people? Because this is so wild. So that was pretty crazy. And I feel like I need a bigger place simply for the fact of being able to host more people and have more people in my home. So, my Venmo is at Ethan Renault. And so you can just send me some money so I can buy a bigger house. That'd be awesome. So I guess that's one of the craziest things that happened recently. I went to the art museum yesterday too, because my friend works there and he got us in for free. So a bunch of us went to the art museum, and it was super sick. And it just made me really inspired to paint again and get more into the visual arts and all that stuff. Classic, normal, creative person stuff. And then, of course, probably the biggest update, actually, I didn't think about this till now, is I will be done with seminary and have my master's degree in biblical studies and theology in biblical, not umbilical, in biblical studies and theology, probably tomorrow. It's whenever I turn in the final draft of my paper. And it's not due for like 2 more weeks, but honestly, I'm just going to turn it in soon. And it'll be the last thing I ever do for my master's degree. And I will be a master, and you all can thusly address me as master from henceforth, if you want to. So if you write in, make sure and address me properly. I'm just kidding. So that's about it. Let's do a rec.
Rex.
Okay, big obvious rec this week. I finally got around to watching the film The Brutalist. And despite its title, it's not like violent or anything. It's mainly, there's one scene that's a little messed up. But other than that, it is, hang on, I gotta sneeze again. It's not coming. Oh, God gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers. Oh my gosh. Okay. So it's The Brutalist, and it's about brutalist architecture, which was a big architectural fad in the mid-century. I think it was like after the war, 40s, 50s, and 60s-ish. It's buildings. So have you ever seen a building that's like raw concrete? It actually comes from the word brute, like concrete brute, which is French for raw concrete. So it's not finished. It doesn't have flourishes or design. It's going to look like cubes with windows, like very modern, really cool looking, a lot of raw concrete, a lot of big blocky elements. But yeah, like it's called brutalism. And obviously when I first heard that term, I thought it meant like, oh, it's like a brutal looking, like a, I don't know, a hardcore looking building. Obviously you can Google brutalism architecture if you want and see what that's all about. But yeah, I've been fascinated by brutalist architecture, honestly, since like shortly before this film was announced. So the timing was actually really good. I read Ayn Rand's book, The Fountainhead, which I don't really recommend, but I didn't love it. Maybe you do. You can disagree with me if you want and be wrong. Just kidding. But The Fountainhead is about an architect, and he's trying to make new raw like building styles based on just like necessity married to beauty, but without flourish and garnish and all sorts of unnecessary addendums on the buildings. So initially I thought that the movie was going to be based on The Fountainhead, just based on the fact that it's about a brutalist architect. And I was like, huh. Turns out it's not, although there are a lot of similarities between the film and the book The Fountainhead. And other people have mentioned it. I wasn't the first to catch that. Although I did catch it before I read those reviews. So, you know, just minor flex. Anyways, the movie stars one of my favorite actors of all time, Adrian Brody. He's the man. He's just, I don't know, he's just an interesting guy. He is in my favorite movie of all time, The Brothers Bloom. And he won an Oscar for The Pianist, he said carefully, where he plays this like starving Jewish pianist during World War II. And this is kind of like part two, maybe, because it's sequentially would be kind of be in that order. But he's an immigrant who moved to the US, and he was a former architect back in his home country in Europe, and he comes to the US and tries to make something of himself, and he's like shoveling coal and getting these like bottom of the rung jobs in the US until he gets discovered for his genius as an architect and starts to build a bunch of buildings, or really design one building for a guy played really, really well by Guy Pearce. I thought Guy Pearce was a phenomenal actor in this film. And Guy Pearce, I've seen him in several movies where he plays the scummiest, awfulest bad guy there is. Lawless is the other one I'm familiar with. Guy Pearce, you might know him from Memento. He's the star in Memento, Christopher Nolan's movie that put him on the map. So really good cast. Guy Pearce, and then what's her name? Felicity Jones was Adrian Brody's wife in the film. I went into watching The Brutalist knowing it was 3.5 hours long. So I actually watched it in 2 sittings. And there is an intermission in this movie that's exactly in the middle of it, which is nice. I guess if you're watching it in a theater, they gave you a 10-minute break so you could go to the bathroom and whatever. It's just like a classy movie. And like the two halves are really divided, and they have a different feeling in the two halves. And I don't know. I really don't want to give anything away. It's epic on the scale of There Will Be Blood, if you've seen that. It's biopic in the same sense, where it follows one guy and his immigrant struggle to rise up and become something great in the US. So yeah, it was interesting. Definitely worth a watch. If you want to watch it in the two halves, like break it up into two. Think of it like 2 episodes, and it's easier. Yeah, I don't know. It just gives you this epic feeling of accomplishment and struggle. And yeah, the acting is so good. The cinematography is so good. And the way that a lot of the camera shots feel really imperfect, it just creates this feel of this is someone making a movie who really knows what he's doing. Brady Corbet directed it, and he did a really great job. I don't know. It's kind of hard to describe without giving a whole lot away. Just if you love artistic, beautiful films that feel epic and have this grand sweeping narrative to them, then you'll like The Brutalist. Like I said, it's 3.5 hours, but don't let that dissuade you. Just maybe break it up however you want to do it. I'm not here to tell you how to live. But you know who is? The meat section. So let's move on to the meat section.
Meat.
So a couple weeks ago, we got a bunch of listener mail, which is awesome for the crowd surfing section. And I'm still getting through that. So if you wrote in a question, I have not forgotten about it. We're just getting through all of them, which is awesome. I love having just an abundance of prompts and topics to discuss on here. It's super great. So keep them coming. We don't want to run out anytime soon. I'm happy to just keep discussing whatever y'all are interested in. I love it. So this is one from our old homie, Chad Denton. We actually had him on the podcast a while ago as a guest. He's awesome. He's a historian, a big history buff. He really knows his stuff. And he, as always, brought up a really good question. He said, "Hey, Ethan," and just as a reminder, pretty soon it will be, "Hey, Master Ethan." I'm just kidding. "Hey, Ethan, since you asked for reader emails, I thought I'd be obliged, although it feels like I'm forcing your podcast into becoming a conversation. Side note, I think that's fine. That's literally why I do this podcast, is to connect with people, the ones who want to listen to it and pitch in and write back and whatever. So write back, attractivechristians@gmail.com. You can Gmail us at any time, night or day. Anyway, says Chad, here's 2 things I'd be interested in getting your opinion on. 1, does God change their mind? 2, how do you commune with God and feel at least some certainty about it? Not in the sense that you hear God's voice or even God influencing your decisions, but just feeling God, if that makes sense. I hope this gives you some material to discuss. Cheers, Chad." As always, Chad comes in swinging hard. Chad comes in hot. And I'm like, okay, Chad, thanks for that. Like, I think we're out of time for this episode. So thanks for listening, guys. No, just kidding. But man, big ones. Okay. Does God change their mind? And Chad used the gender neutral pronoun there. Does God change their mind? I might accidentally say he or his, but I don't think it matters too much. Basically, does God change God's mind? I think this is such an interesting question, and I don't remember if I talked about it in the past, maybe back when Tucker was on the show, about the idea called open theism is kind of what's being asked here. And that's kind of the big impetus behind this notion of open theism, which is God does not know the future, is kind of their big statement. Or maybe they would make it one sentence and say, God does not know the future because the future does not exist and is inherently unknowable, and therefore God cannot know it. God can't know something that doesn't exist. And this is like a big philosophical question, one that I'm probably not fully equipped to discuss all the way, because obviously people have been debating this for a long time. So I'll just lay out some of the open theists' ideas and arguments and let you all decide for yourselves. Because I think that some people would disagree with this, but I think that the open theists actually make a lot of compelling arguments. So again, open theists believe God does not know the future because the future does not exist, And if God doesn't know the future, that means the future is not set in stone. And that also means that God moves through time with us, with his creations, as we all kind of work together to shape the future and shape what the future becomes, right? So, one thing that open theists will point to a lot is the story of Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you remember, Abraham kind of negotiates with God about the city, like, should I save it? Should I destroy it? God's saying, and he negotiates and he says, like, I forget the numbers, but it's like Abraham says, spare the city if there are 50 righteous people. And God says, okay, I'll change my mind and spare it if there are 50 righteous people. And then he goes down, I think it's like 45, 40, 35, 30, 25, you know. He was like, if there's 10 righteous people, I'll spare the city. So right there we see God changing his mind as Abraham prays and negotiates with them. And one thing that, I mean, the obvious response might be, well, God already knew how many people were in the city. And it's like, yes and no, because that doesn't seem to be implied in the text at all. We also have other stories. You have stories where the opposite happens, of course, like God hardens Pharaoh's heart to bring about God's will so that God is the one kind of controlling humans. But again, we also see the opposite happen where humans pray and God does things. I mean, I'm not going to give a specific example, but think about every time someone prays in the Bible and it gets answered, right? Even Jesus, when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he's crucified, he says, God, if it be your will, let this cup be taken from me, but it's not your will, it's not my will, it's your will that should be done, right? Why, just logically, why would Jesus ask for God to change the plan if Jesus knew it would just never happen? You know, was he just wasting his breath? Was he, you know, or was there actually, you know, in we call it hierarchical, I forget the fancy terms now. I've been out of school too long. The hierarchy within the Trinity, the functional roles that they play. God the Father is often described as knowing the plan, and the Son and the Holy Spirit don't always necessarily know the plan. But God the Father is the one kind of coming up with the plan and dictating it, and the other two kind of help bring it about and make it happen and execute, right? So Jesus is saying, if there's another way, let's take it. Why would Jesus say this if there was no possible chance of changing God's mind? I don't think it was mere performative prayer. Like, let me just say this and express my trepidation about going to the cross, right? I think he actually was hoping that there might be another way to bring about the reconciliation of all things to God, other than the cross, right? Of course, God didn't change his mind in that instance, but it begs the question, why would Jesus have prayed it so desperately, pleading for God the Father to change his mind, right? We could point to any time that someone performs a miracle and say, technically, that's a change of God's mind because, like, I don't know, Elijah raising the dead woman or dead woman or dead girl. I don't remember. Man, I'm getting rusty, you guys. But think about it. Like, if Elijah hadn't come in and prayed for her to be raised back to life, then it probably wouldn't have happened. She would have stayed dead. And that means that, you know, by simply saying something or doing whatever he did, Elijah changed God's mind, you could say, because dead people don't normally come back to life unless someone prompts God to give them life again, right? That's just the way things work. So the open theist could point to tons of Bible stories and just be like, look, here's a human doing something that prompts a change in the way that things normally go, you know, because a human intervened. And you could say, you know, like again, the Calvinist and the Arminian would go back and forth on this infinitely, because like, it's like, well, yeah, but God premeditated the person to do that. And to be honest, my typical feeling is like, I don't feel like I'm a puppet on a string just being guided around through a bunch of premeditated or pre-planned motions and actions and words, you know? I don't think any of us feel that way. We probably feel like we all are autonomous, free-willed beings. And in that sense, then, the Bible seems to present humans as partners with God, not puppets of God, and not servants, not slaves, but partners, you know? That's kind of what we see in the Adam and Eve story, that God creates all this and then partners with the people to take care of it. You know, it says that God put them in the garden and then they were there to tend it, to have dominion over it, to take care of it. Like God legitimately handed over care of the garden to the people. It doesn't say, but God made sure that they did everything right. Like, there's legitimate free will there. And I think that the very fact that God gives us free will and partners with us to bring about good in the world, or destruction, obviously, that points to the fact, in my opinion, or in the open theist opinion, that things are not set in stone. And if things are not set in stone, then that means that God's mind is flexible. And I also think that, like, I haven't come up with a better explanation or a good response to this, but like, if everything is set in stone and God does not change his mind, then what is the point of prayer? You know, like unless our prayers are simply, God, thank you for everything you've given me, the end. Like, why would we pray for anything to happen? Like, oh, God forbid my mom got cancer. God, please take this away. You know, and in essence, what you're asking is for God to change his mind. The plan was going one way, where this person got cancer. We pray desperately for God to change his mind and reroute the course and take it away. And in the instances where that happens, you know, one way to look at that would be to say that God changed his mind. God granted the answer to prayer. God defied the laws of physics and biology and healed the person of their disease, right? So I think that the answer to the question, does God change God's mind, is a very nuanced yes. At least I think that's kind of what you have to conclude if you look at the Bible, if you look at prayer. I think that there's overarching things that God doesn't change God's mind on as much. For example, do I believe God will triumph over evil once and for all in the end and restore things to himself? Yes. You know, now how exactly that happens might be flexible. So one last little example, which I think is really interesting. The story of Samson. If you're familiar with the story of Samson, give it a read. It's 4 chapters. I believe it's Judges 13 through 16. And so if you look at the story of Samson, he's one of 4 people who, before he's born, God says, here's my plan for this person's life. And in this case, it's he will strike a blow for me against the Philistines. Okay? So before he's born, God says, this is my plan for Samson's life. He's going to strike a blow against the Philistines. And so, and God says, you have to raise him as a Nazirite. Now, with the Nazirite vow, there's some really interesting things like, what is it? Leviticus 16, Deuteronomy 16. It's one of the 16s in the Torah, one of the chapter 16s. So it describes the Naz vow. And basically there's 3 components of this Nazirite vow. Don't cut their hair. They can't drink wine or even touch grapes. And they can't touch anything dead. Okay? So Samson is going to strike a blow against the Philistines for God. He just can't cut his hair, can't touch dead things, and can't touch grapes. Okay? Of course, As a boy, Samson knows this. He grows up knowing it, knowing that that was his vow. And it's interesting, if you read the story, he touches a lot of dead things. He kills a lot of people, and he hangs out in vineyards a lot. It doesn't necessarily say that he was drinking the wine, but if your whole vow is to not touch grapes, you probably shouldn't hang out in vineyards. And worst of all, who is he gallivanting around with? Philistine women. He's supposed to be striking a blow against them, but instead he's hooking up with them. Like, his girlfriend is literally a Philistine woman. And later, there's another Philistine woman, the infamous Delilah, who ends up cutting his hair, right? So by that point, he has broken all three things he was supposed to keep, right? Like, for me, that'd be a fairly easy thing to keep, because I don't drink that much. Like, I could easily not drink ever again. I don't touch dead things that often. Like, I wonder if meat counted. I don't know. And I could just not cut my hair, it's whatever. So he breaks all three of those things, which are not that hard to not do. And then he gets captured by the Philistines. He gets chained to a mill. He gets his eyes gouged out. And it's then that he finally regains his strength. His hair grows back and he regains his strength, and he pushes down the temple of Dagon that he's in and kills, I think it's 3,000 Philistines. This is all off the top of my head, so if I'm getting it way wrong, I'm sorry. So he kills 3,000 Philistines, and the text says, and therefore he killed more people in his death than he ever did when he was alive. And he killed several hundred people, like with a jawbone of a donkey, earlier when he was alive. So he killed hundreds when he was alive, and when he died, he brought the temple down, pushed it apart with his strength, and killed thousands of Philistines, right? So, why is this relevant? Because God had an ultimate plan for Samson's life, to strike a blow against the Philistines, right? And did he do that? Ultimately, did God bring about the plan he had, big picture, to do that? Yes. Did Samson probably have a choice in how that blow against the Philistines was struck? Also, I think yes. Because I think if Samson had obeyed, if he had never gallivanted with the Philistines, if he never hung out in vineyards and touched grapes, and if he never touched lots of dead things, and if he kept the vows, and if he just, married a good Israelite woman, whatever, and basically just obeyed God and obeyed the Torah and obeyed the law, things probably would have gone better for him, where he doesn't end his life blind, chained to a mill and a slave to the enemy, He could have raised up an army of Israelites to strike a blow against the Philistines and kill thousands of them that way, and had a long, great life with a family, And either way, God is right, because God still uses Samson to strike a blow against the Philistines. However, Samson chose to do it the more painful way, right? So I think it's like there is an incredible amount of free will that God gives us while still bringing things together to execute God's plan in the way that God best sees fit. Does that make sense? So I think, like, big picture, God has a plan, but he is partnering with humans to bring about executing that plan. Does that make sense? I know that that's kind of peripheral to the question, does God change God's mind? But I think they're really interconnected, obviously, because why would God change his mind? Well, because humans are doing certain things to make God change God's mind. And so I think that's my answer, is like, yes, a very qualified yes. And you really have to understand, I think, how God works and the autonomy God has given to people, and the way that God works in really mysterious ways. Like, God might not know the future, but God knows every little molecule happening in the world right now, this second. And he knows what happened last hour. He knows what happened yesterday, all this stuff. So it's not like God is, when we say God doesn't know the future, It's not to say that God's dumb or, oh yeah, God doesn't know anything. Like, no. Take the smartest AI that knows every detail about every molecule in the universe, and it just doesn't know the future, but it would have a pretty good idea of where certain things are going. And, if it was partnering with people to move into the future for the good of everything and everyone, that could it could be really interesting. So I think that is how I would explain that. I wish that this was a conversation, because this could go a whole bunch of different ways and they'd all be super interesting. And then to Chad's second question, it won't take nearly as long. I don't think. I guess it could, actually. So again, his second question was, how do you commune with God and feel at least some certainty about it? Not in the sense that you hear God's voice or even God influencing your decisions, but just feeling God, if that makes sense. I'm going to be real honest with you guys. I feel like I have a really hard time feeling God's presence or hearing God's voice and all of those connected things. Like I can't point to a time in my life where I'm like, yes, God said this. I clearly heard or felt or thought that God said this. Part of that could just be my own fault for not spending enough time in silence and meditation and listening, right? But there have been times that I have gone to meditate or just sit quietly and listen and wait for God to speak or to do something. And when it happens, it's not like a crazy, profound, like, whoa, God did something crazy. For me, how it has felt is like, like if you're sitting in a room reading a book and someone else is on the other side of the room also reading a book, and you're not looking at each other, you don't hear each other, you're not talking to each other, but you're reading your book and you just know that they're there. Like you feel the presence of the person in the room. Or like, I don't know, like most of the time, if you're like in a room by yourself, you can just know when someone else comes in. If you don't hear them, you don't see them, but you just feel the presence of the person, unless they're trying to sneak up on you or something. But still, it's like, as humans, we are very attuned to the presence of other people and other animals and other things. And that's the best way I've described it. If I have felt God, where I like settle myself down, there's no music playing, there's no nothing, it's just silence, it's just contemplation, it's just meditating. I'm not reading, I'm not distracting myself in any way. And I pray a little bit and I just try to talk to God, try to listen to God. And it's just a very, very gentle feeling, like a peaceful feeling, like a sense of peace descends, like God is here now. And I wouldn't say that that's something that I have felt very often, Chad. Like, it's not like every single time a Christian goes to meditate, they feel God and have this crazy supernatural experience. In my experience, those are pretty rare. I mean, think about Moses, who was born in Egypt. He was raised, by the Egyptians and the Israelites both. And when he's 40 years old, he kills a man and flees to the desert of Midian. And he like kind of gets in with these shepherds out in Midian. He marries a wife named Zipporah. And in the animated film, she is really smoking hot. And I'm like, dang, Moses did pretty well for yourself. And he's a shepherd for 40 more years in the desert. So that makes him 80 years old. And when he's 80 years old, he finally sees the burning bush. And then God speaks to him. God introduces himself as the God of Israel, Yahweh, the God of Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, not in that order. And right, so he finally hears from God after 80 years. And I feel like Christians have this impression that we're just supposed to always constantly be hearing from God if we're good Christians. And I actually think that can be really detrimental to tell people, because then if they don't, then that makes them feel like they're bad people, or like God doesn't like them, or they're doing something wrong, or whatever, you know? Moses had to wait 80 years before he encounters God. And this is really a side note that doesn't necessarily fit, but there was this line I just looked up from a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and she wrote, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God." Moses realizes that day that actually God was always everywhere. That the very reason that life exists, the reason that leaves grow out of the trees, the reason that, you know, he breathes, the reason his sheep are alive and wander around and bump into stuff, the reason for all of that is because God has infused the life of God into all of it. And I feel like sometimes as Christians, we try too hard to look for, what should we say, more supernatural things. Like, I've never heard from God. Well, yeah, but you woke up today and look at all the crazy things around you, you know? You could take a tiny little seed smaller than your fingernail and drop it into the earth and it would turn into a tree. That's not supernatural to you? Like, that's not something that's absolutely wild? And then you could eat from that tree and you could stay alive. Like we kind of have become numb to how alien our existence is. It's just wild. Like, if you could like take a bunch of mushrooms and erase your brain so that you didn't know anything about the earth and people just told you about how earth works, you would be like, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. You know, like you have a little hole in the top of your body where you just suck in the air all around you and then you blow it back out through this little hole all day long. And if you don't do it for 2 minutes, you're dead. like, and the air is just the perfect balance, you know, all of it. I don't know. Anyways, this was a detour, but every common bush is afire with God. And Moses doesn't realize that for 80 years, depending on how poetically you want to interpret that. Either Moses realizes that God is everywhere and that he has a calling to do something great and he goes and frees his people, or God actually shows up and speaks to him in the burning bush. Either way, it took Moses 80 years to really have a defined encounter with God, where he woke up, realizes his purpose, says, whoa, that was God speaking to me. That was God making me realize something new. It was an epiphany. It was this moment that changes and shapes everything for him, right? So all that is to say, oh man, there's also 1 Kings 19, where Elijah is in the cave and he's looking for God, right? A fire comes through the valley, God's not in the fire. A wind comes through the valley, God's not in the wind. An earthquake comes through the valley and God's not in the earthquake. And then there's a silence. And suddenly Elijah pulls his cloak over his face and he's like, whoa, this is God speaking to me. And sometimes it's that silence where God speaks to us, but often we're too busy focusing on everything else, all this loud stuff, the flashy stuff, the fire, the wind, the earthquake. Like, you're not going to hear from God if you're constantly drowning God out. You're not going to have that sense of that presence, you know, that little feeling that you mentioned, Chad. You're not going to have that if you're always watching TV. And if you're not, you're listening to a podcast and you're watching or listening to music, or you're, you know, working and talking to people and you're always doing something. Where does that moment fit in to feel God or to sit back and experience that? And so, like I said, that's just a personal anecdote from me for how it sounds or feels to me. I know a lot of people have very different things. I know people that have heard the voice of God, whether it's audible or just some word that was an impression to them from God, like in their mind, all sorts of stuff. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's whatever. I think it is that God knows each of us, and God knows what method will reach each one of us the best, you know? So for me, it might be one thing. For someone else, it might be something totally different. So there's not just one cookie cutter answer that fits all for this question. I think it's a really good question. And dang, I could talk a lot longer about it. But those are a couple initial thoughts. Seek God in the silence. If you're hungry for God to move or to be present or to speak, seek it. Make space for it regularly. It might not happen the first time, might not happen the second time, might not happen the third time, but you keep making space for it. Kind of like how you don't get ripped the first day you go to the gym. You don't get ripped the fifth day you go to the gym, but you keep going to the gym, right? And I'll end with this verse. It actually popped into my head a few days ago, and it just came back again. So it's a verse from James. I had to look up where it is. Submit yourselves to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Especially those first two lines. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. I think that's a promise that we get in Scripture. And I've spent a lot of my life not resisting the devil, but just kind of giving in. And a lot of my life not coming near to God, but actually just kind of staying far away and doing my own thing. But this is a promise that if you resist the devil, he will flee from you. And if you come near to God, he will come near to you. And I think that it seems really simple because it is really simple. And yet we don't really do it. We don't come near to God because a lot of other things have our attention much more. A lot of other things seem much more enticing and appealing. And oh my gosh, what's this shiny thing or this cool trend or this funny Instagram reel or whatever. And so we don't actually end up coming close to God for him to come near to us. But it's so simple and it's right there anytime that we seek God. I think some translations say seek God and he will come near to you.
Okay, but which language do you want me to translate to?
Oh my gosh. Did you hear that? That was creepy.
I heard. Translation says seek God.
Well, whatever. Jeff Bezos is trying to weigh in on this biblical exposition. Anyway, that's James chapter 4, 7 through 10. Great little section of scripture. And then last little thing I'll say and wrap up this long episode. If we want to hear the words of God, or I guess I should say, if we want to know the words of God, we have a book that's over 1,000 pages of God's words. I think interpreting them is much more complex than just reading it and saying, okay. There's so much homework that goes into it. But I think that there is something really, really good and beautiful about faithfully just picking up your Bible, opening it, reading it, trying to live it out, trying to look more like Jesus every day. Every person that bashes on Christianity still has to have some respect for Jesus. They're always like, yeah, at least I haven't met anyone who's like, Jesus was a terrible person. Like they all recognize that, and we all should just try to look a little bit more like him. And the way to do that, there's so many words in the Bible. So if you're like, man, why hasn't God ever spoken to me? It's like, well, you do have access to a lot of words that God has given us. So, passed down through history and complex and hard to understand sometimes and confusing, but it's there. So I hope this is helpful. I wish I could just keep talking with you guys, and I wish you were talking back. Maybe that'll happen sometime. But until then, Gmail me more. attractivechristians@gmail.com. I'm Ethan. Thanks again to Annie and Mark, and I love you all. Stay attractive. Bye.